All roads lead to the abject. The monstrous feminine and gender boundaries in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Ask anyone what they remember of Stanley Kubrick's 1980 horror film, The Shining, and you'll most likely hear an account of Jack Nicholson's character axing his way through the bathroom door, inserting his head in the opening and growling, "Here's Johnny!" That image of the father gone violently mad has become emblematic of the film, much as the image of the blood-soaked prom queen has defined Brian De Palma's Carrie, 1976. Video releases of The Shining invariably feature patriarch Jack Torrance in some state of insanity, usually with his head through the bathroom door, staring at his unseen wife. Academic essays also show an obsession with the image of Jack's madness. Even when Jack is not the primary focus of a given article, as in Christopher Hoile's piece, The Uncanny and the Fairy Tale in Kubrick's The Shining, he still retains his iconic status. The decision to cast a star with such a dominant and manic persona as Jack Nicholson only adds to our tendency to focus on him as the source of horror. Kubrick may be making a commentary on a wide range of topics, but it seems that The Shining is ultimately a movie about a male monster. Thinking about The Shining in terms of Jack Torrance's threat to his family could certainly lead us to believe that the film is fairly progressive in its ideology. As Robin Wood observes in Hollywood from Vietnam to Reagan, American culture tends to repress that which may be a threat to the interests of alienated labor and the patriarchal family. Such threats include, among others, women and female sexuality, any sexuality that is not normatively heterosexual, ethnic, usually non-white subcultures, foreigners, alternative ideologies, the proletariat, and children. The horror film often depicts such marginalized groups and ideas as monstrous, as occurs with the queer makeup artist Pete Drummond in How to Make a Monster, or the terrible pubescent girl Regan in The Exorcist. However, The Shining presents us with a white patriarch who is convinced that he must discipline his family by killing and dismembering them with an axe. The film's apparent demonization of Jack is so overwhelming, in fact, that critic Frank Manchel feels compelled to defend the villain protagonist. By failing to scrutinize why Jack is seduced by false myths of success and patriarchal authoritarianism, we ignore the appeal of such seductions and focus only on the symptoms. Although Manchel repeatedly asserts that he does not abide Jack's violence, the critic considers him the victim of patriarchal forces that permeate the Overlook Hotel and American culture in general. The hotel was, after all, built by the Jet Set in 1907 on Navajo burial grounds amid attacks by Indians enraged at such a desecration. Hotel manager Mr. Ullman shares this information without any sense of horror or remorse. It is simply a bit of interesting trivia, such as the fact that 4 presidents have stayed at the hotel. The ghosts of the Overlook's past haunt Jack both literally and figuratively. Not only is he persuaded by ghostly waiter Delbert Grady that he must kill his family, he is driven by notions of the American dream that require men to achieve material success at whatever psychic cost to themselves or others. Manchel astutely observes that in Jack's interview with Mr. Ullman, the latter has a small American flag sitting atop his desk, a motif that underlines the connection between the smug, self-assured patriarch and a nation founded on the oppression of racial minorities, women, and anyone or anything that does not benefit straight white men with money. Rather than simply letting Jack off the hook, Manchel's analysis of the film places the ultimate blame on patriarchal values and institutions in general. It appears that The Shining does not fall prey to that 80s movie trend, which Robin Wood has observed, of presenting monsters as purely evil. More importantly, the explanation for Jack's monstrousness suggests that patriarchy's suppression of the feminine is itself dangerous. Kubrick's film stands apart from countless 80s horror pics and shares more of a kinship with Brian De Palma's 1976 film Carrie. Much like Jack Torrance, Carrie White is a victim of repressive patriarchal social institutions. The school principal is so inattentive to her feelings about her traumatic first menstruation that he cannot even say her name correctly. Carrie's mother adopts a psychotically extreme form of Christianity, condemning Carrie's menstruation as Eve's curse. Both Jack's and Carrie's acts of violence may, in their own ways, be read as the results of institutionalized repression. However, neither Carrie nor The Shining offers patriarchal repression as the only source of monstrosity. Both films instead present a range of horrors, asking us to be afraid of repression, while at the same time suggesting that certain things just need to be repressed. In her analysis of Carrie, Shelley stamped Lindsey refutes traditional readings that consider the film a celebration of the protagonist's feminine power. Carrie is not about liberation from sexual repression, but about the failure of repression to contain the monstrous feminine. Lindsey observes that the audience is not meant to identify with Carrie as she destroys the gymnasium. The split screen instead makes a spectacle of the monstrous blood-soaked Carrie, as well as the death and destruction she causes. We are meant to gaze in horror upon both sides of the screen and distance ourselves from the subjectivity of the girl we were earlier hoping would escape repression. As Lindsey notes, our separation from Carrie's perspective encourages us to fear the feminine, especially in the conclusion, in which Carrie's friendly classmate and prom survivor Sue dreams that the late Carrie thrusts her bloody hand out of her grave and grabs Sue's ankle. In shifting the narrative perspective from Carrie to Sue at the end, the film completes the transfer of Carrie's particular horror to the female population as a whole, and attempts to displace its masculine fantasy of horror at the female onto the female subject herself. Now a part of Sue's subconscious, Carrie threatens not patriarchal forces of surplus repression, but women themselves. Although the Shining's central figure is himself a patriarch, the film operates similarly to Carrie in its treatment of the repressed feminine. The film does make a monster out of the repressive patriarch, but it also codes the feminine as monstrous, and equally threatening as the patriarchal forces that would try to contain it. Kubrick's film shares not only Carrie's fear of the female body, but also powers that are coded feminine. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the film's treatment of The Shining. When characters shine in the film, the soundtrack provides music very similar to that which plays when Carrie telekinetically destroys the prom. A deep resonant bass note plays unrelentingly while Danny sees visions and hears voices, just as it does when fire spreads through the Bates High School gymnasium. One might argue that The Shining itself is not being coded as horrible. Rather, the patriarchal violence that Danny witnesses through The Shining is the true horror. To support such a claim, however, one would have to ignore Halloran's shining to Danny. In the dry food storage room, as Halloran shows Wendy the wide variety of goods available for the winter, Danny stands off to the side, staring into space. His eyes widen and his mouth gapes as the long bass note, accompanied by a shrill, piercing high note, plays. We expect the reverse shot will be a spectacular display of blood or gore, perhaps a repetition of the blood gushing from the elevator door. Instead, we see Halloran, still speaking with Wendy, although that conversation is muted, yet turning to Danny and telepathically asking, "How do you like some ice cream, Doc?" Unable or unsure how to respond, Danny remains catatonic and gazes back at him. Although there is a follow-up scene in which Halloran explains how The Shining works, it cannot erase the impact of the ominous music. We are meant to feel uncomfortable about The Shining itself, not merely the patriarchal horrors it sometimes displays. Halloran's shine to Danny may prove that The Shining itself is monstrous, but it remains to be seen how The Shining is specifically a kind of monstrous feminine. In American culture, we do tend to feminize the kind of power Halloran displays when he knows to call Danny Doc, women's intuition. The mise-en-scène of Halloran's shine to Danny promotes this cultural gendering. Although Halloran holds some authority as the head chef, his cooking and his race subordinate him to white patriarchs like Ullman. The scene makes that separation apparent, as Dick inspects the kitchen facilities with Wendy and Danny, while Jack talks off-screen with Mr. Ullman. The shine may occur between two males, but it is located in a distinctly feminine sphere. Dick's story about the non-spoken conversations he would have with his grandmother further feminizes this power. Not only is it introduced to Halloran through his grandmother, but she also invents the term shining, establishing it as a kind of matriarchal institution. Stephen King's novel The Shining takes this concept even further, as Halloran muses, "I think all mothers shine a little, you know, at least until their kids grow up enough to watch out for themselves." Although Dick does not explicitly make such a suggestion in the film version, it is well within reason to consider shining an especially maternal power. Lacanian psychoanalytic theory generally regards preverbal communication as a special province of the mother-child relationship, or the imaginary order. To progress into the masculine symbolic order, a child must acquire language, understand the difference between self and others, and generally follow the principles of the law of the father. Feminist psychoanalytic theorist Irigaray employs a bodily metaphor to explain the patriarchal construction of children's move from one order to another. According to this symbolic order, when a child is given a proper name, it already replaces the most irreducible mark of birth, the navel. A proper name, even a forename, is always late in terms of this most irreducible trace of identity, the scar left when the cord was cut. A proper name, even a forename, is slipped onto the body like a coating, an extracorporeal identity card. Irigaray views the insistence on such symbolic markers of identity as a denial of our origins from a bodily mother. American patriarchal culture insists on such separation, however, encouraging children to grow into adults and cut the apron strings, a domestic metaphor for the umbilical cord. Deciding how progressive The Shining is in its gender politics ultimately rests with how one reads The Shining and other appearances of the maternal feminine within the film. In Camera Politica, Michael Ryan and Douglas Kellner contend that Kubrick merely examines the sexual psychopathology of right-wing disciplinarianism and primitivism. They deny the possibility that, in his examination, Kubrick may be reproducing the fears of the natural, bodily woman, and encouraging the audience to dread feminine sexuality in general. It is understandable that these critics would consider the film merely an examination of such misogyny. Much of the film's dread of the feminine is filtered through Jack or his ghostly advisors, Delbert Grady and Lloyd the bartender. Grady insists to Jack that his wife and son be violently corrected for their failure to obey him, while Lloyd simply utters trite misogynist cliches like, "Women, can't live with them, can't live without them." However, while the film acknowledges that such commonplace misogyny is dangerous, or at the very least wrong, it indulges in a more subtle misogyny that must be examined in all its elements. Fear of the abject. Generally, The Shining's misogynistic treatment of the feminine can be attributed to a fear of the abject, that which defies boundaries of separation from the self. As Julia Kristeva explains it in Powers of Horror, it is something rejected from which one does not part, from which one does not protect oneself as from an object. Imaginary uncanniness and real threat, it beckons to us and ends up engulfing us. The abject is horrifying because it is something that disgusts us, yet comes from us, or from which we come. Abject bodily fluids, such as blood, vomit, feces, pus, mucus, and others, are things that our culture teaches us to see as foul and therefore wish to conceal in shame. Since such fluids are traditionally horrifying, the feminine body that produces one of them, blood, every month is especially monstrous. Birthing is perhaps the most terrible abjection of all, as the feminine body produces, amid blood and amniotic fluid, a child connected to its mother via the umbilical cord. With all these signifiers of abject horror culturally constructed around motherhood, failure to cut the apron strings is not merely a sign of immaturity, it is a sign of certain doom. The umbilical cords. From the opening credits, and in many instances thereafter, The Shining presents images of horror connected with the natural world and, by association, the feminine. The scene opens with an aerial view of a ravine. Presumably shooting from a helicopter, the camera moves along the vast, twisting gorge as the soundtrack plays deep, ponderous notes. The camera spies a car below, which we will later learn belongs to Jack, dwarfed by its immense surroundings, and follows it along the winding road. Manchel uses the scene to bolster his claim that Jack's illusions about making it big have already been predetermined by a hostile universe. While there is certainly a sense of alienation conveyed by the helicopter shot, it is interesting that Kubrick chooses to frame the alienation as man against nature. If the director were more interested in presenting the alienation of capitalism, why not begin the film at the Overlook Hotel, with Jack surrounded by images of wealth that he can never hope to attain? Instead of experiencing that possibility, we witness that Jack's failure to achieve the American dream is predetermined by the natural world itself, coded feminine not merely by our cultural associations of nature with the feminine, but by the winding umbilical cord-like road connecting eventually to the Overlook Hotel itself. The implications of this feminine coding of Jack's surroundings are too important to elide. While the Overlook Hotel's history may remind Jack of the wealth denied to him by patriarchal capitalism, the opening credits sequence suggests it is an overpowering mother, not an imposing father, who denies him this opportunity. With this metaphor in mind, one can read the road itself as a kind of umbilical cord from which Jack cannot free himself. He cannot be his own man, because he is still connected to a monstrous feminine that refuses to let him succeed. Of course, one might argue that this construction of Jack as victim of the monstrous feminine is merely a piece of misogynist nonsense presented through Torrance's perspective. Indeed, as he later descends into madness, Jack accuses Wendy of fucking things up for him, attributing his financial and creative failures to her. By this time, Jack has agreed to follow Delbert Grady's instructions and kill his family, so it is incredibly difficult to see him as a victim of anything but a psychotically repressive patriarchal ideology. However, the monstrous feminine in this film is not merely a construction of Jack's misogyny, but a force that transcends his subjectivity. Although the umbilical road leads eventually to the Overlook Hotel, its parallels extend to the grounds and the interior of the building itself. Outside the hotel stands a giant topiary maze, whose twists and turns reflect those of the great network of hallways inside. Both of these structures were built around 1907, Mr. Ullman informs Jack. The suggestion that the topiary maze was built suggests man-made, feminine nature disciplined by phallic trimmers. Ironically, the hotel's hallways follow the opposite course. The monument to patriarchal excess features hallways haunted by feminine ghosts. Whenever Danny pedals his tricycle or walks down the long network of hallways, he encounters the monstrous feminine. It seems that if you follow the cord long enough, eventually you will arrive at the mother. Twice he approaches room 237, and on his second trip he finds an unlocked door, and then is attacked off-screen by the ulcerous woman. When taking Danny's experiences of the monstrous feminine into account, one cannot dismiss these umbilical pathways as merely the projection of Jack's psychotic fears. Dangerous fluids. The feminine is further demonized in the film's representation of the hotel's bloody past. Although the ghost of Grady tells Jack that he had to correct his wife and children because they disliked the hotel, we are not shown Grady murdering his family. Rather, the film relies on the horror of the abject, the blood that comes forth from the bodies of murdered females. Danny's first shine in the movie reveals elevator doors that release an overwhelming stream of blood, followed by an image of Grady's two daughters holding hands. Displacing the blood from the male murderer to the daughters and a gaping orifice suggests the polluting menstrual blood that Kristeva discusses in Powers of Horror. Such blood, quote, stands for the danger issuing from within the identity, social or sexual. It threatens the relationship between the sexes within a social aggregate and, through internalization, the identity of each sex in the face of sexual difference, end quote. Jack experiences the horror of the blood's release not through his visions of the girls or the elevator, but from a dream that he kills his family. Wendy wakes Jack from his disturbed sleep to see him drooling, as if purging himself of the horrible vision. Significantly, his dread seems to come not primarily from the murders themselves, but from what he sees in their aftermath. But I didn't just kill you, I cut you up into little pieces. Seeing the abject innards of his family is something particularly horrifying for a man so obsessed with boundaries. During the scene in which Wendy interrupts his writing, Jack becomes livid and creates a new rule that she may not enter his writing space, the lobby, while he is there, regardless of whether he is typing or not. After Wendy accuses him of harming Danny's neck, Jack goes to the barroom and speaks with Lloyd about problems with the old sperm bank upstairs. Jack expresses his anger at Wendy's accusation by reducing her to a collection of his bodily fluid. However, his obsession with boundaries and projection of male fluid onto Wendy reveals his own instability as a masculine subject. Jack may be trying to obey orders from the masculine ghost Grady, but he is, in the meantime, unconsciously working to satisfy the demands of Grady's daughters and using their language in the process. When Danny encounters the daughters in the hallway, they beckon to him. "Come and play with us, Danny, forever and ever and ever." With every iteration of ever, the daughters are shown as bloody corpses and then as alive and closer to Danny's position. Later on, when Jack beckons Danny to sit with him on the bed, the father expresses his love for the hotel, insisting, "I wish we could stay here forever and ever and ever." Jack's descent into madness is not simply a regression to a primitivistic masculinity, but his surrender to a polymorphously gendered house of spirits that is monstrous because of its lack of boundaries. Bodies enmeshed in bodies. After being assaulted by the ulcerous woman from room 237, Danny endures a similar feeling of abjection to his father's horror at seeing his family hacked to pieces. He trembles and emits a slow stream of drool. All the while he is shining what he has witnessed to Dick Halloran, who is vacationing thousands of miles away in Miami. Upon receiving Danny's message, he tries to find out if the family is all right, then quickly makes arrangements to fly to Colorado. Since Wendy and Danny have no other way to communicate with the outside world, the phone lines are down and Jack has disabled the radio, one might expect that Danny's shining would be regarded as positive. However, when Wendy snaps Danny out of his drooling and trembling, Tony informs her, "Danny's not here, Mrs. Torrance. Danny can't wake up, Mrs. Torrance. Danny's gone away, Mrs. Torrance." Danny's imaginary friend, who lives in Danny's mouth, hides in his stomach, and shows him things, has for a time taken over Danny's consciousness. His shining has become truly monstrous. Indeed, Tony's takeover of Danny's mind is akin to the triumph of the mother half of Norman at the conclusion of Psycho. This phrase from Psycho is particularly appropriate to The Shining, as Danny is completely overcome in this scene by a maternal force. Paradoxically, while Tony seems to have a maternal power over Danny, telling him what to do, deciding what dangers to reveal to him, Danny conceives of him as within his body, even in his stomach, as if Tony is a child that will never be born. The film presents Danny's relationship with Tony as no longer symbiotic, but rather parasitic, and ultimately repudiates the bond so that Danny can become a more mature masculine figure at the conclusion. Trance-like in his movements, the Tony half of Danny picks up a knife and a lipstick and moves toward the bathroom door near the bed where Wendy is sleeping, after locking Jack in the dry goods storage room. Using the lipstick, he writes "Red Rum" on the door, then shouts the nonsense word at an unconscious Wendy, who gradually awakens and grabs the knife from Danny/Tony's hand. While such a gesture could easily be read as the act of a castrating mother, stealing the phallic knife away from a little boy, Wendy's subsequent actions do not suggest that she has undermined Danny's burgeoning masculinity. As soon as she grabs the knife, she sees Red Rum in the mirror, spelling murder. Immediately after this mirror translation, Jack pounds on the locked bedroom door with an axe, causing Wendy and Danny to flee to the bathroom. Far from castrating Danny, Wendy has played a fundamental role in moving him into the symbolic order. She participates with Danny in a mirror stage, helping him to separate himself from Tony and to find language, turning Red Rum into murder. She even symbolically cut the cord by pushing Danny out the bathroom window, allowing him to slide down the snowdrift and fend for himself. Physically unable to fit through the window, she can only encourage him to run to a safe hiding place. Kristeva Hoile has noted this birthing metaphor, but he conceives of it as a move toward mature, civilized selfhood and away from the animistic, not as an escape from the feminine imaginary into the symbolic order. However, Freud, whom Hoile cites extensively, links the masculine to civilization, and the feminine to the pre-civilized, the animistic, in Civilization and its Discontents. Quote, "The work of civilization has become increasingly the business of men. It confronts them with ever more difficult tasks and compels them to carry out instinctual sublimations of which women are little capable." End quote. Abandoning Tony like an old toy, Danny defeats his father not by means of any psychic powers, but through his wits. After running for several minutes through the snow-covered topiary maze, Danny carefully backtracks and hides on the other side of a large shrub. No longer able to trace Danny's tracks, Jack is left to die in the snow, as Danny and Wendy escape in the snowcat abandoned by Halloran. Although Wendy is the only living female in the house, her sending Danny out on his own was in the interests of masculine subjectivity. Therefore, she is permitted to survive the narrative. Jack, on the contrary, since his subjectivity is already compromised by the masculine and feminine spirits that haunt him, allows himself to be immersed in the monstrous feminine topiary maze. Since the hallways and hedge maze are parallel structures, Jack appears in an old photograph on one of the overlook's walls. He stands smiling at the center of a formal party, and the date reads July 4th, 1921. Failing in the patriarchal masculine mission of disciplining his family, he takes up the feminine mission of the daughters, playing forever and ever and ever. racism, and the abject feminine. Finally, even though Halloran is a sympathetic character, his killing does serve the ideology promoted by Danny's victory. If Wendy is the good, self-negating mother who can cut the apron strings, Halloran represents the mother figure that remains too close to a boy for him to become a masculine subject. King's novel, on the other hand, depicts Halloran as a much younger, stronger man, and in spite of serious injuries in his efforts to rescue Danny, he survives the ordeal and continues to befriend Mrs. Torrance and her son. Additionally, it is made clear that Danny continues to possess and use his shining power without harm to his psyche. Kubrick's film, however, cannot abide this prolonged connection between the Torrances and Halloran. Due to a mixture of racist and sexist anxieties that plague Hollywood cinema and American society more generally, Halloran becomes the sole victim of Jack's abortive rampage. White Hollywood cinema's long-standing racist fears of black men's sexual desire for white women can be traced most memorably back to D.W. Griffiths' Birth of a Nation, 1915, in which members of the Ku Klux Klan are made into heroes for avenging a black character's attempted rape of a white woman. When faced with pairing a black man with a white woman outside the context of a romantic relationship, Hollywood films often supply a kind of safeguard to ease racist white male anxieties concerning rape. The black male character may be mentally retarded, as in The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, or significantly older than the white woman, as in the various Ashley Judd, Morgan Freeman pairings over the past few years. The Shining opts for this latter option, casting then 70-year-old Scatman Crothers as the Overlook Hotel's chef. Introduced as a kind, innocuous elderly man, Halloran bears no sexual threat to the white female lead character, and can be sent to the kitchen with her without white racist unease from other characters or white audience members. In fact, the only attempt to sexualize Halloran appears in a brief scene at his home in Miami, where paintings of scantily clad black women hang over his bed and over his TV set. In this small detail, we learn that his desires are aligned along racial lines, and even then confined to images rather than real women. Being desexualized as a man in Kubrick's film, however, only heightens the threat Halloran poses as a feminine figure. The film's ideological project demands his removal, not as a sexually aggressive black man, but as a representative of the abject feminine power of The Shining. I doubt very much that Kubrick intended to create a film that ultimately supports the repression of the feminine in favor of a more conventional masculinity. After all, his films have always challenged patriarchal institutions such as the army, science, government, and the family. However, for Danny to overcome a hysterically aggressive father, he has to free himself of his unwieldy feminine power and think of a rational way to outwit the monster lurking close behind. One of the things that distinguish this film from Carrie is that the possessor of the psychic power in The Shining can be strong without it, and need not be utterly destroyed by it. Although both films display feminine power, The Shining presents it through a little boy instead of an adolescent girl. Among the more subtle regressive messages these movies endorse is that powerful femininity is best contained in a male child, so that he has the agency to grow out of it when necessary, in order to enter public life.